Welcome to week 9 here on the Coach Poe Show. I'm your host, Coach Poe, and we've got an exciting show lined up for you this week. I am joined by Kris Ferguson, who covers Super Region 2 for D2 football and does a great job covering several conferences in Super Region 2. And so you probably see him on our Sunday night show inside D2 football. But we have an exciting week as we look at week 9. We had the first regional rankings released. They were released in alphabetical order. And so I've got Kris here this week with us. And welcome to the show, Kris. Appreciate you taking time and hopping on, buddy.
It's always fun getting together.
It always is. It always is. I've got to ask for the viewers, though. We know you're on the road a lot. Are you home? Are you on the road? Where are you at this week?
No, so I actually have a day job on top of all this, and it does keep me on the road. So I am on the road today. I was actually at home yesterday, but just one night out.
I'm convinced that some people hop on the show to see where is Kris. Where is Kris this week? So I appreciate it. And so we're going to dive right into it, right, Kris? So, we had the first really regional rankings released this week, and they were alphabetical. So there's no rhyme or reason to how they are. They put the top 10 teams in every super region out there. And we're going to take a look at it here in a minute, but just your overall thoughts on what you saw this week on the rankings.
Yeah, I guess from my vantage point covering the CIAA, it was very surprising to some of the followers of that conference to see two teams not on this list, Virginia State and Virginia Union, both who only have one loss. And you look at this list and you see teams that have two losses on here, and there are notable omissions. Outside of that, I think the other one is Fayetteville State at 6-2. They've been, kind of laying low, just sort of, chipping away at the season. And I think to see them over the two Virginia schools really, really stands out. No surprises here in terms of the Gulf South. Not really many surprises, even from the South Atlantic either. But I think, the other piece, seeing so many HBCUs on this list with the SIAC having so many teams having really good seasons, certainly is a little bit of a departure from the norm as well, especially given that the SIAC, hasn't always had great showings in the last couple of years, and certainly has kind of returned to form in challenging some of the other conferences for playoff spots.
Well, that's a great point, Kris, because, as long as I can remember, the SIAC has really struggled to put teams in the regional ranking. So it's definitely different seeing some of those teams up there and some teams that we're not used to seeing, right? I definitely agree with you. Not seeing either of those Virginia teams is a little surprising. But I think in terms of the Gulf and the SAC, I don't think there really are any surprises. And I think what we have from those schools right there is what we're going to have. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of, we have a couple weeks left of the regular season. We have some championship games that have to be played. And so I think that's probably going to be the tale of the tape. And we're going to dive into it here in a second, pull the rankings up and kind of dive into it a little bit. But just to kind of let everybody know, Kris has been gracious enough to hop on the show this week. And so we are not going to sit here and debate who should be where, how we think they should rank. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about scenarios, right? And we're going to look at kind of what we think could potentially happen. Obviously, the committee has a hard enough time figuring it all out and putting it all together. And basically what we're kind of assuming is that it's based on the criteria that we saw in the past. And so you never know from year to year how that's going to change. But we're going to dive right into it. So as you can see here, this is the Super Region 2 rankings that are listed on our website, d2football.com. And if you look at it, again, it is an alphabetical order, and there's no rhyme or reason. And so Benedict at 8-0 in Division 2, Delta State 6-1, Fayetteville State 6-2, Fort Valley State 6-2, Lenore-Rhine 8-0, Mars Hill 6-1, Miles 5-1, Valdosta State 5-1, West Florida 6-1, and West Georgia 5-2. So like you said, there's a couple schools, Virginia State, Virginia Union, that are not on this list. And that does not mean that they can't get on this list. Kris, like we talk about all the time, this is just the top 10 right now. We have some matchups coming up in the next couple weeks that are going to shake this list. And there's going to be a handful of teams on this list right now that we won't see in a couple of weeks, as we know. And then there's going to be some teams not on this list that will creep their way onto this thing. So I think the first thing I kind of just want to talk about is we have two undefeated teams right now, and that's Benedict and Lenore Ryan. And we could sit here and speculate who's going to be one, who's going to be two, but you got to imagine, Chris, that both of those teams are going to be 1-2 here in Super Region 2 when they get announced next week, and they're actually ranked as you would see them if the playoffs started on Monday.
Yeah, I think that both of them. It's very unusual to see a undefeated team not being those top slots, and so in this particular case, yeah, you've got two very compelling cases for who could be number one at the end of the season should they both win out. Benedict's got Savannah State, Allen, who's actually 6-2 right now, and the SIAC championship game left to play against presumptively Miles.
Right.
And Lenore Ryan's got a pretty interesting slate as well. A surging Wingate,
Yeah.
Catawba in their championship game against a presumptive Mars Hill.
Right.
And so I'm really looking at that championship game for the South Atlantic Conference because, if it is truly Mars Hill and Lenore Ryan gets over that is such a huge strength of schedule boost for Lenore Ryan. That be what pole vaults them into the number one slot?
For sure.
Is what I'm really kind of curious about. So
yeah, I agree 100%. I think you're 100% right, and that's kind of the curious thing to me. I think when we talked about Benedict, I think you look at their schedule and they're I think they're probably a little bit better than maybe they were last year, right? And so you're gonna, as we sit here today, and you're never gonna say, hey, they're gonna win out, but we gotta assume they would win out. But like you said, if Lenore Ryan does win out, are you sitting there if you're Lenore Ryan saying, hey, we want a Mars Hill to win out to then play them in the championship game and have another one loss win on your resume to maybe try to bump you up that next spot, right? Like that's kind of the hope that we would have there, and it's gonna, I think with the Tusculum loss last weekend at Emory and Henry, that kind of shook up that division a little bit there, Chris, because those two, Tusculum and Mars Hill, were kind of on that collision course, right? Going to the championship game.
Yeah.
And so things have changed a little bit, but Tusculum now has 3 losses, so you got to imagine that probably leaves them on the outside looking in, probably.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be intriguing to see kind of what happens, and neither one of those teams can slip up, because if you fall to the 1 losses, as we can see, there's a bunch of 1 losses on there, and if you go to a 1 loss team, you could lose home field. You might be on the road week 1. You may, there's so many variables that can happen, and if no team in this division, in the super region rather, are undefeated, I don't even want to, that gives me a headache to even think about that, Chris. That just gives me a headache when you start thinking about that. But no, so those two are 8-0, and you gotta, it's going to be interesting to see how the pieces shuffle out. And again, we kind of base that off of the assumption of the criteria is the strength schedule, right? Like that's what we've seen it to be the last couple of years. You got to assume that's probably what it's going to be again. But again, if that holds true, that's what we're looking at. And then we flip to the 1 loss teams, Chris. And you look at Delta.
Headache's coming.
What's that?
I said, the headache's coming.
Yeah, exactly. And so you look at Delta State, you've got Mars Hill, you've got Miles, Valdosta State, and West Florida. So you've got a handful of 1 loss teams right there that, like you said, they give you a headache when you start trying to figure out who is where based on strength of schedule. Again, if that's the criteria. But we know, for example, that Valdosta and West Florida play this week. So you're going to have one of those teams go to a 2-loss team, right, Chris? And, Mars Hill, again, it's every week in the South Atlantic Conference is a tough week. And so you look at that and you just don't know. Delta State, the Gulf is... Again, you can't take it easy in any of these conferences that we're talking about. So kind of, and then you've got Miles kind of lurking there at a 1-loss team. And I guess give me your thought on the 1-loss teams. And I've got a question to ask you about Miles.
Well, and when you look at what they have left, I think the teams that are most vulnerable at this point are Miles and Valdosta State. Valdosta in particular, they played Delta. They started strong, keeping up, and then they kind of faded as the game went on. And And to me, Valdosta State is kind of still in a rebuilding mode. And so at this point, it feels like they're kind of ahead of schedule. But here's what they got left. They got West Florida, West Alabama, West Georgia, and they go to UWF, then UWG, then UWA,
Right.
and
Right.
and West Georgia is in that two loss camp that we're about to talk about. So basically, it's a probably win or you're home for the playoffs for Valdosta at this point. Um, that's just how interesting things are for them. Now Miles has to play, a couple of tough games. They've got Albany State, who's 500 right now. They've got Tuskegee, who, if Tuskegee wasn't playing in the Turkey Day Classic, they would be on this list.
Right. Without a doubt.
But because they're not, yeah. So and they're on 2 losses right now. And
Right.
those are two pretty tough games. And if you got, and then they've got, what would be a rubber match against Benedict. And, you know, you get 2 losses from the same team. I mean, they don't really ding you twice for that.
Right. And
But they really got to get through these next 2 games. And so they also look pretty vulnerable trying to get through these 2 games with just 1 loss.
yeah, for sure. And I think that's and that leads me to my question, Kris. Like, how do you think the committee, or how do you think it gets viewed if Miles does lose? Let's say they go to play Benedict, and if they win, well, that throws everything into turmoil. But if they don't, right, and they get the 2 losses, do they kind of forgive that second loss, do you think, by Benedict, because you've lost them already once in the, regular season, or do you think that puts them down to that 2-loss group that we talked about?
No, I think they'll forgive it.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, it is important to note that like Miles can hang with Benedict.
Right.
They were actually up in that game, and then they kind of faded late. And so, this is a team that certainly it can compete with them. And,
Right.
and it's not inconceivable that they could win, that rematch. So, but I think the committee would forgive that and certainly try to avoid, if Benedict's not in the number 1 position, you would hope that they would try to avoid them in the first round.
Right.
Although we have kind of seen that where, teams that have played relatively recently late in the season end up playing each other again. I think that happened with I want to say Assumption and New Haven recently, that they played in the regular season and then they end up having to play again first round. And
Right.
it was like a game or 2 before the first round that they had to play all over again.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think they'll forgive it.
Yeah. Well, and I think, it's I think championship games are kind of that catch-22 almost, because you sit there and you say, hey, we want to make it, but do you punish, and this is always the challenge for me, do you punish a team that loses in a championship game and reward the teams that didn't go to the championship game, right? Like, I think it can help you if you're at large, let's say, like it's going to help you move up, but I don't know that it should help you fall down. Like, I'm going to, like, I would use, and I'm just going to use this scenario because I pay more attention to the SAC, but if you had Lenore Ryan Mars Hill play, let's hypothetically say Lenore Ryan wins. Well, that drops Mars Hill to the 2-loss teams, and then that brings a whole mess of other teams into it. But do you penalize a team for making that championship game, right? And then help the other 2-loss teams get to that level, or do you just not, or do you not count that, right? That's the other thing. But the other side of that, like if a team like Mars Hill wins in that situation, man, that can help them move up, right? And then, so there's so many different scenarios that we could see here. And again, particularly these 1-loss teams, we're going to see some 2-loss teams come out of this. And I think that when you bring it to the 2-loss teams, Kris, you bring in some 3-loss teams into the conversation, or it opens that pool of 2-loss teams. Because you look on this list right now, Fayetteville State, Fort Valley State, West Georgia all have 2 losses. And then don't forget about those 2 Virginia teams that we talked about that have 2 losses,
right,
in Virginia State and Virginia Union. So you open up that pool.
No, they have 1 loss.
That's right. I'm sorry. That's right. I'm sorry. But so then at what point do they start jumping some of these 2-loss teams and whatnot? Like, it's what give me your thoughts here on these 2-loss teams that we see on the screen.
You've got Fayetteville State, Fort Valley, and West Georgia. And make no mistake, Fayetteville State's got to win out in order to get into the playoff field,
Yeah.
because otherwise they'd become a three-loss team. But they benefit from the fact that Lenore Ryan's having such a good season, because
Absolutely.
that's one of their losses, and then the other one being USC Pembroke, and they're also having a really good season too. So they're really benefiting from that, and so you got that piece of it. You To me, I think the CIAA is only going to get one team in. Looking
Right.
at it right now,
Right.
and it's whoever is the championship winner is the one that's going to make it in. So then you're kind of stuck with West Georgia, who was on the outside looking in last year. They've got some potential to get SOS bumps because of the fact that West Georgia's got to play Delta still.
Yeah.
So if West Georgia's going to finish with two losses, that means that Delta is going to be the one that's also going to have two losses too.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah,
Uh,
and so, man, it's just so many things to think about. I think the one team that's going to get left out of this, unfortunately, and it will be the second year in a row, is Fort Valley.
okay.
Fort Valley's got a non-countable coming up this weekend, and then they've got Albany State, and so they can certainly end up 7-2. And it's always kind of been my belief that teams that only play 10 game schedule kind of get punished versus the teams that play 11 games.
Right.
Well, this year they'll only have 9 um, division 2 games, since those sub division 2 or even FCS games don't count.
Right.
So I think they're going to be the one kind of left out unless something like you start having a bunch of 3 loss teams.
Right.
So yeah.
And that's the thing too, right? And we start talking about 2 lost teams, but I mean, like the two, and I guess it's definitely a numbers thing, strength of schedule. I'm assuming whatever that number may be. That's why we don't see the Virginia State up there and the Virginia Union. That's not saying they won't get up there, as some of these teams lose. But you make a great point, right? If West Georgia wins, that brings Delta State to a 2-loss team, and they're going to have a pretty high strength of schedule. And now you've got West Georgia. You'd have in that scenario a Delta State, and then either a West Florida or a Valdosta State at a 2-loss team. And so, I mean, there's so many different scenarios you could see there. If Delta wins, you got to imagine West Georgia falls at a 3-loss team, that group of 3-loss teams, and I don't know that they can get back into this thing unless everybody starts knocking everybody off, right? And at that point, you start running out a little bit of a time. But I could see the South Atlantic Conference potentially only getting one team in, right? Like if Lenore Ryan wins out, Morris Hill, if they fell to the 2-loss teams, and that counted, I don't know that the SAC gets two loss teams in, or two teams in, one with 2 losses.
That would be one of those scenarios where the Gulf South gets 4 teams in, and everybody else just gets the scraps. I don't know. I truly think that Morris Hill will get in, and it might be more of a distribution where it's 3 Gulf South, 2 South Atlantic. That will give you 5.
Yeah.
And then you've got the CIAA and the SIAC with potentially 1 apiece. With Miles being the other one that could be the sort of the wild card here. So
right.
I don't see four Gulf South teams getting in right now. I just don't. That conference is such a gauntlet.
Right.
It's anybody is capable of beating anybody.
Yeah.
And they're certainly capable of beating up on each other.
Sure.
So it's going to be really interesting to watch.
Well, and the other thing too to that, Chris, and I think up to your point is if you bring this thing into the 3-loss teams, as you look at it, man, you've got all of a sudden now Limestone and Wingate right now with 3 losses apiece. And I would make the argument, at least in the SAC, that Limestone is probably the best 3-loss team probably in the country right now. I mean, they are playing well. And because don't forget, they play West Alabama early, they play West Georgia early, and then they lose to Lenore Ryan. So there's your 3 losses. And I mean, if it gets to 3-loss teams, I think you bring a whole new pool of teams into this thing.
So Limestone, if I remember correctly, they lost to both West Alabama and West Georgia, right?
Yes.
And so one of the criteria too is wins over teams 500 or greater,
Yeah.
and so I think that kind of sets Limestone back a little bit that they couldn't get over the hump. Whereas you kind of look at some of these other schools, they're going to have teams over 500. They're going to have
Right.
a couple more wins there. So that's probably a negative
Yeah.
for Limestone, but still, I mean, and Wingate, gosh, they are just, Limestone and Wingate were like left for dead.
Yeah. Oh, agree. 100%. 100%, Chris. And they're just kind of chipping their way back into it. And you look at it and you look at Wingate. I mean, a win this week against Lenoir-Rhyne would throw this whole thing into flux as well, right? And whether they
Yeah.
put themselves in position to get in or not, that remains to be seen. But you throw this whole thing into flux, and now and then at what point do those 2 1-loss teams not on the board come into play? I don't know, man.
Well, I mean, and keep in mind too, you got the head-to-head, right? So if you
Yeah,
have Morris Hill and you have a Limestone that are 3 losses, then Limestone's actually going to have the head-to-head.
yeah, it's. Whew, man, there's so many different scenarios that we could sit here and talk about, and we could dive into, and but man, it's
Right.
exciting. I'm happy to see the list. I mean, I think, and we could look at all 4 super regions, and we could sit here and talk about that all day long. But I think when you see this, and I think we'll have a little bit more clarity come maybe Saturday night, a little bit to where some of these numbers lie and where they are. But yeah, so I'm excited about it. I think I mean, I'm just excited that, and now every game matters. Every single game matters from here on out.
Yeah. Oh
So,
yeah, no doubt.
is there
I think
anything?
I think I,
Go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say the one thing that would be really interesting is that there's a team that's in the Super Region 2 footprint, but not in Super Region 2
Okay,
based on conference affiliation.
I got you.
That that could also make things really interesting if we get down to 3 losses, if they can get into the top 7 on their end, and that's the USC Pembroke.
Yep. Yeah, I knew exactly where you're
Pembroke
going
has
with
three
that.
losses. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this concept now where you can actually swap regions,
Yep.
and they're just the one like perfect school that could easily swap into Super Region 2 if they were able to get into the top 7
Yeah.
in Super Region 1. Now, is it possible? Anything's possible. Is it
Right.
likely? Probably not.
Sure.
They're probably a year away. We're probably having this really conversation that is a lot more realistic next year, I think.
Yeah.
But it's just fun to think about. It's just fun to think about.
It really is, and we talk about this on the national show quite a bit too, just about like looking at, whether it's moving super regions and the earned access and avoiding first round rematches, and I think it's important that we talk about this too, because I think this is it's a sore subject among a lot of people, and I just kind of want to make this clear. This, Chris, because we talk about this, but I think it's important for everybody to remember that in Division II, it is a regionalized model, and that is the model that we have for our playoff setup. You can't compare it to FCS, you can't compare it to obviously FBS, but even Division III, we have a regionalized model. And one of the things that they don't want to do is and because we're regionalized, you're going to see a lot of first, second round matchups that we've already seen potentially. And we don't see a ton of it here in Super Region 2, but we do see it across some of our other super regions. But it's also important to note that the NCAA, one of their major initiatives, I would say, is to typically avoid first round flights. And so we have to keep that in mind, and we can complain until we're blue in the face. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. We are in a regionalized model, and this is what we're dealing with. And so as much as we hate to see rematches in the playoffs, until it changes across the board, this is what we're going to see. Right, Chris?
That's right. And the one thing is, I don't want to see Lenoir-Rhyne and Fayetteville State play in the first round. Like,
Right.
we've already done that,
Right.
right? But that's the kind of risk that you have in a setup like this.
Absolutely. It's that risk reward, right, Chris? Like
Hmm.
That's the potential we may see when we have issues like this, and we're in this setup. But I think the other thing about it is, and it's hard to beat a team twice. Trust me, it is hard to beat a team twice. But it's important to remember that when you get to that point in the season, every play matters, and it doesn't matter who you're playing. And I would say this: I would almost rather, as a fan, have a rematch that I can go watch than have to send my team across the country and not be able to watch the game in the playoffs. Early at least, and so I think that's just important to clarify. And I know if there's questions about super regions, if you're new to the super region model, check out our national columnist, Chuck Bittner. He does a great job kind of explaining how all this works out. Tune in on Sundays because we are always talking about it, whether it's Kris, myself, or any of the guys, or any of the columnists that write for our D2 football columns. This is, you can get all your information there. But yeah, Kris, so I guess to wrap it up, I mean, any departing thoughts, anything you'd want to push out there as we kind of wrap this week up and start looking forward to Saturday's games?
Well, there's so many games to think about, so many things to look at. Don't be surprised if you see teams come out of nowhere that jump into the top 10, because we will have rankings, true rankings that this upcoming Monday. So don't be surprised by any of that. It's just important to note a couple of things. Those wins against the FCS schools don't count. The losses don't count either. And I think that really helps with emphasizing Division 2 and what Division 2 is all about. But outside of that, it's just have fun, because it's going to be a real roller coaster of a ride to finish the season. So
It is, and hopefully we can get back together here as we start looking towards the playoffs and kind of do a little bit of a recap and kind of we'll look back on this show and be like, well, we were completely wrong, or hey, we hit the nail on the head on that one, right?
Right.
But well, Kris, I appreciate you hopping on. I appreciate you taking the time to speak to all of our viewers here in Super Region 2, and look forward to seeing you on Sunday night. And to all of our fans, appreciate you tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got some stuff from it. And we look forward to seeing you here next week on the Coach Poe Show. And as always, enjoy your football Saturday. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tune in here on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, all your socials to get your fix. You can reach out to K Ferg or myself. And we appreciate it. Enjoy your football Saturday, and we'll see you next week.